All right, so for this lecture, we're going to take a little bit of a look specifically at pregnancy, not only pregnancy in and of itself, but the effects then on the mother, as well as the development of the fetus at the same time. So, stages of pregnancy and development. So we go through essentially 4 stages. We go through what's referred to as fertilization. So this is union of egg and sperm cell. We go through embryonic development. So this is development of the zygote, the fertilized egg, from a single cell to a multi-cell. And then we go through fetal development. So once we get to a point where that single cell has divided enough, it can start to develop into the human. And then from there, the last step of that whole process is childbirth. Right. So let's take a look at fertilization first. The timeline for this whole process is somewhere between 24 to 48 hours. So it really, the egg itself is actually available for about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So once it's been ejected from the ovary, it has about 12 to 24 hours to make contact with a sperm to become fertilized. Sperm, on the other hand, can actually remain in the female reproductive system anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. So there's a little bit of a window there. The process has to take place in the fallopian tube. We talked a little bit about that before. And the sperm have to make their way through the vagina, cervix, and then through the uterus itself, and then into the fallopian tube. So for fertilization to take place, intercourse can't occur any more than 2 days ahead of ovulation. And no more than 24 hours after ovulation. Otherwise, then we run this window of 12 to 24 hours where the egg is no longer available. So it's a fairly small window here. So it's only up to about 3 days in and around that ovulation time. It takes sperm about 1 to 2 hours to make their journey, so it doesn't take them near as long as what it takes the egg. The egg takes somewhere around 2 to 3 days to make it from the ovary into the uterus, so it's a much slower process for the egg as it is for the sperm. And the sperm, once they do reach the egg, are actually attracted by chemicals that are being released by the egg cell, and they sort of act like a homing device when they do that. A little bit of the mechanisms of fertilization. You probably heard that we can only have one sperm cell fertilizing one egg cell, and that is correct. So the membrane on the outside of the egg cell is what actually accepts the sperm cell. So the first one to make contact is normally the first one to kind of make their way in, but it's not so much contact with the outside of the egg cell, it's with these receptors on the inside of the egg cell. So once those receptors have been breached, or the sperm cell bonds with one of those receptors, the egg does not permit a second one to do that. The video I think I've got posted for you guys tomorrow that talks a little bit about this process, says that it actually is better if you're a sperm cell that shows up late, because the initial sperm cells fight their way through this zona, and then they get kind of tired. Once they're tired, they move out of the way, and then another sperm cell will kind of move its way in. But it's these receptors on the inside of the egg that can't be breached. Once they're breached, then no other one can take place. The egg cell then, at this point, once we have fertilization, the joint of those two cells then undergoes that second set of meiotic division. So it will then have its number of chromosomes, expel the rest of it, and then essentially be a single-celled organism at that point. Fertilization occurs essentially when we have the combination of those two cells, so the sperm cell and the egg cell, and they form this third cell called a zygote. So the zygote is the combination of both sperm and egg. It's a fertilized egg. All right. The zygote essentially is the first cell that makes us up. It's the first cell of the new individual. It's the result of the fusion between both the egg and sperm cells' DNA. So that's why half of your DNA is your mom's, half of your DNA is your dad's. The zygote then starts rapidly dividing of mitosis at this point. Once we have fertilization that takes place, the zygote then starts that process in the fallopian tube and then has to move its way to the uterus. And you can see in this diagram down here how slow that process takes. So ovulation takes place here at day 0. Fertilization usually will take place somewhere around that day, somewhere between days 2 to 3. All right. And then it'll start dividing once it's fertilized around that first day. So it happens fairly quickly. And then the cell, the ball of cells makes it into the uterus around days 8 to 9, and that's where implantation takes place. So that's a fairly slow process when you think of it, and lots of things can go wrong along the way here. All right. Once the cell reaches a certain stage, it's referred to then as an embryo. So once we make it to about the 9th week, right, that cell really starts to divide and then becomes what we refer to as an embryo. All right. So the embryo is the first um, division without growth. So it actually just doubles the number of cells. It just keeps doubling and doubling and doubling. Once the embryo hits about 16 cells, it can then enter the uterus. So it should be pretty close to the uterus at that point in time. And then the embryo still has not implanted into the uterus at this point. So it's actually relying on just secretions inside of the uterine walls to kind of keep itself nourished at that point. All right. Once we get hit about the 100-cell stage, the embryo now turns into what we call a blastocyte, which is simply just a ball of cells. That at this point, though, that ball of cells will actually start to produce hormones, specifically that human chronoic gonadotropin hormones, so that HCG. Right, so that's the one that'll start being produced. It will then also start to kind of prod along the corpus luteum to produce its own hormones, trying to keep this pregnancy viable. There are two basic areas of the blastocyte that are functional at this point. There's called a trophoblast, which is kind of a large fluid-filled sphere, which will eventually become the amniotic fluid, and then an inner mass of cells, which will eventually become the fetus. All right, so there's three primary layers in that that inner cell mass. All right, so there's what's called the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. We've heard these terms a couple different times. So the ecto is the outside layer. The meso is then the middle layer, and then the endo is the inner layer. So endo in, ecto out, and then meso usually means middle here. The late portion of this, it'll try to implant itself hopefully by day 14. If it doesn't, then the cell no longer really can live on its own and then can be aborted, and then we'll end up with that at day 14. Okay. This just shows you a little bit of kind of what that looks like. So each one of those layers is going to turn into something. Okay. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So the outer layer, the ectoderm, will actually turn into our nervous system as well as our skin. The endoderm, that inner layer, is going to become mucosa and glands, and then the mesoderm, that middle layer, just essentially becomes everything else: bone, muscle, and everything else that would make us up. This is kind of what it looks like as it moves its way through that process. It's a similar diagram that we just saw a little bit ago. So there's your zygote, the two nucleuses kind of joining together there. This is early what we call cleavage. This is 4 cells, so one cell is divided and then another cell is divided. And then we just continue this process. Here's what the blastocyte kind of looks like. So here's your fluid, all right, and then the mass of cells. And then at the point of implantation, this is kind of what that cell will look like. All right, development after implantation here. Okay, so the big thing that we have happening is these chorionic villi. All right, these are little projections that reach out away from the blastocyte. They will eventually make up the junction between the placenta as well as the uterine wall. All right, the embryo then starts to surround itself with more of that fluid, amnion fluid, and then at some point in time, an umbilical will start to form that will attach itself to the embryo and then kind of implant into the placenta. All right, just kind of showing that again. Here's your umbilical cord formation here in between those kind of layers. So here's your ectoderm, your endoderm, and your meso. The umbilical cord kind of reaches out from both of those layers. These are the little chorionic villi that are kind of reaching out. Okay, they're going to form most of what's going to make the placenta up. All right. Functions of the placenta, those are kind of important. So this is what actually forms the barrier between the mom and the baby. There is actually no blood exchange, just nutrients here. So a lot of times if a mother has, say, like an infection, that infection, unless it can be transferred across this membrane, doesn't end up in the baby. It's also one of the reasons why the mother and the baby can have different blood types, because there is no exchange of blood here, just simply nutrients. The only problem is that we can have some issues with pregnancy is if the baby's blood type is one and the mother's is another. Usually if the mother is negative and the baby is positive, we can end up with some issues. But I think we have a slide that will talk about that here in a little bit. All right. The other thing that's happening across this area is removal of waste. So the baby is not really processing that waste, the mother is. And then we also have a lot of endocrine organs working here to try to produce some hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, and they're all simply just there to help maintain this pregnancy. All right. At about the 9th week, the blastocyte turns into what we refer to as a fetus. All right. So all of those organs about the 8th week are started to kind of form. And then the baby just simply kind of starts specializing a lot of those other organs at this point. Okay. This stage from the week 9 on is the one that we show the most tremendous growth and change in appearance. So it goes from being just that ball of cells to now being starting to look more and more like a human, right? The pregnancy itself can have quite a few effects on the mother. So a pregnancy is just termed as the period of conception until birth. And there are several anatomical changes that will happen to the mother as well as physiological changes. So anatomical changes, obviously the uterus will start to enlarge to accept the growing baby. We start to see an accentuation of the lumbar curvature, so that curvature of the lower spine, again, trying to support this weight that's going to be coming. And then we've talked about this before in the hormone unit, but you see a relaxation of the ligaments of both the pelvis as well as the pubic symphysis. That's the joint between the front of the pelvic bones. And this is due to the production of that hormone that we talked about during last unit called relaxin. Okay. Physiological changes, there's lots of gastrointestinal system changes. So the mother starts to experience morning sickness. And this is normally due to the increased levels of progesterone. Not all moms get it, but normally they get some form of it. They'll also start to get a little bit of a heartburn. And this is mostly because a lot of those organs are starting to be crowded out by the fetus. So they're being pushed upwards against the diaphragm. They tend to have a little bit of some constipation. Again, the uterus sits in between the spine as well as the digestive system. So because of all this kind of space being taken up, we see a decrease in mobility of the digestive tract, so that they have a little bit of an issue. All right, urinary system sees some issues as well. So the kidneys have to take on that additional burden of fluid from both the baby as well as the mother. And then the other problem with that, though, is that the uterus usually starts to compress the bladder. So they have to go to the bathroom, but they don't have as much space to accept as much of that urine in. So they have to go more often. All right. Respiratory system obviously sees some changes as well. So the increase in fluid can increase in nasal mucus and cause congestion, as well as they can start to swell some of those the respiratory cavities. And then vital capacity, the amount of air that they can breathe in, as well as respiratory rate, also is going to increase because, again, there just isn't as much space. So the mother's respiratory rate usually goes way up, but their breathing rate, the depth of the breath goes way down because they just don't have the room to do it. Cardiovascular system, we see a rise in body water as well. Again, blood volumes are going to increase because of that by about 25 to 40%. The baby's asking for more nutrients, and the only way for that to happen is the mother's body to be able to kind of take that on. Because of those couple things, though, blood pressure is going to increase as well as pulse. All right. And then because of these two things, the pressure as well as the number of the increase in pulse, mothers tend to be more susceptible to varicose veins. So varicose veins happen when the valve in the vein, which is the vessel leading back to the heart, kind of fails, and the pressure in the system is usually what causes that. All right. The last stage then we got to talk a little bit about is childbirth. Labor itself is actually referred to as parturition. All right. This is a term that I would make sure I know because it does usually show up on some of our assessments. And all that is simply the series of events that is used to expel the infant from the uterus. Labor itself is initiated specifically by a couple different hormones. So oxytocin is usually the main one. It's being released by the pituitary in response to the stretching of the uterus. And then the placenta is going to release its own hormone at this point in time, prostaglandins, which is going to cause a spike in estrogen levels and then continue to increase those uterine contractions. The combination of both of these hormones contracts that central layer of the uterus, the myometrium, that muscular layer, so that we start to get these kind of contractions that hopefully will slowly start to expel this baby from the uterus. Labor itself can be broken up into 3 stages. We get what's referred to as dilation, expulsion. We get dilation, expulsion, and placental stage. So dilation simply is where the cervix starts to become dilated and enlarge, goes from 0 centimeters up to 10 centimeters. We get uterine contractions that start to begin at this process. These uterine contractions help usually spur along this dilation. And then usually at some point in time in dilation, the amnion ruptures. So this is where usually women say that they lost their water or their water broke. Second step of this process is expulsion. So this is simply just the infant passing through both the cervix as well as the vagina. Normal deliveries are head first. Anything that is not head first is referred to as a breached delivery. All right. The body is pretty streamlined if it goes head first. Then the arms can be folded down to the side as well as the legs. But it's not unheard of for the baby to try to come out arm first or feet first. It's very hard on the mother though, because it takes a lot more pressure, and then usually those end up in cesarean sections. Okay, the last step is the placental stage, and this is simply just the delivery of the placenta itself. It finally detaches away from the walls of the uterus and then can be expelled along with the umbilical cord. All right, developmental aspects that we see here. Sorry. All right, so gender is actually determined at fertilization. So males, we've learned this from bio, XY is males, XX is females. Gonads, though, don't really start to form until about the 8th week. Testes actually form first in the abdomen and then have to descend into the scrotum about a month before birth. And then really the determination between whether the gonads become testes or whether they become ovaries is the presence of testosterone. So if there's enough testosterone available, they'll become testes. If there's not, they will become ovaries. The reproductive system really doesn't function until puberty. We've talked a little bit about this already in female anatomy. Puberty happens somewhere between about ages 10 to 15. Specifically in women, puberty is driven by weight. All right. I think I mentioned this before, but it usually requires women to weigh about 100 pounds before the menstrual cycle really will kind of start. All right. The first menstrual cycle usually occurs about 2 years after puberty. So usually around age 12, but it's not unheard of to happen before that. Again, driven by weight. Most women reach their peak reproductive ability in their mid to late 20s. All right. And then obviously the further away they get from that, the more it goes down. And then usually the longer they wait after their 20s, the incidence of things like Down syndrome babies and other types of issues in pregnancy can start to increase. All right. We talked about this one already. Menopause is simply when ovulation and menses cease, so that the menses really stop functioning as an endocrine organ. And for men, there really is no equivalent of menopause, but we can have a steady decline in testosterone production. Okay. All right. So big things from this lecture: know your stages of labor, know the stages of development. If you've got questions on any of those, please make sure you're reaching out and asking. Otherwise, we will pick up with male reproductive here towards the end of the week. Okay.